Hey, I thank you for coming tonight. I know you don't do many of these shows, and it's a delight to have you here. And you're going to be here for about another week or so, you said, around the country? I thank you for being here. I hope you had fun.
Thank you.
Johnny Carson was famously unshakable. He could rescue a dying interview, defuse tension with a single joke, and turn failure into comedy without breaking a sweat. But every once in a while, a guest came along who pushed him to the limit. Someone unpredictable. Someone unsettling. Someone who didn't care about the rules of television at all. These moments weren't chaotic by accident. They were chaotic by nature. And in those seconds, late-night TV showed its fragile edge. This is a look at the most unhinged guests ever to sit across from Johnny Carson. The ones who made live television feel dangerous again. Paul Ehrlich. Over 3 decades behind The Tonight Show desk, Johnny Carson interviewed thousands of guests. Politicians, movie stars, comedians, and musicians all passed through his studio. But only one guest ever pushed the show into genuinely dangerous territory. According to Mark Malkoff's book, Love, Johnny Carson, the mood inside the studio shifted dramatically after Carson invited Stanford professor Paul Ehrlich onto the show. Ehrlich was the author of the 1968 bestseller The Population Bomb, a deeply unsettling book that warned of catastrophic consequences caused by unchecked population growth. The ideas were controversial, and the backlash was fierce. Carson, however, was fascinated. He didn't treat the book as a one-off curiosity. Instead, he brought Ehrlich back again and again, 18 appearances in total, clearly convinced the topic mattered, even if it came with serious risks. Ehrlich's first appearance triggered an avalanche of public response. Thousands of letters flooded the show, and some of them crossed a chilling line. Death threats began arriving, aimed at both Ehrlich and Carson. Despite the danger, the show's talent coordinator, Paul Block, later noted that Carson never wavered. He believed the country needed to confront environmental collapse and the uncomfortable conversation around population control, no matter how angry it made people. One particular taping captured just how tense things became. While Ehrlich waited in the green room, Carson walked in to tell him another death threat had just been received. Carson, unsettled, asked how he should handle something like that. Ehrlich replied with dark humor, suggesting he be seated at the end of the couch in case the shooter missed. The joke landed lightly between the two men, but the crew was anything but amused. Fear spread quickly through the studio, and staff demanded real security. By the time the show went live, roughly 30 New York police officers were stationed throughout the building, watching every entrance and corner. When Carson stepped out for his monologue, he addressed the danger in the only way he knew how: through comedy. He made a casual remark inviting any would-be killer to get it over with, since he was dying anyway. The staff, fully aware of the threat, laughed hard. The audience at home had no idea anything was wrong. To them, it sounded like just another Johnny Carson joke. On camera, Carson remained unshaken. Off camera, something changed. Malkoff notes that he slowly began to distance himself, building a kind of emotional barrier between himself and the public. His longtime assistant, Ginny Beauregard, later described him as becoming colder and more aloof, not out of arrogance, but out of self-protection. The threats were only part of it. Fame itself brought a steady stream of unsettling encounters. Former Tonight Show correspondent Louisa Ermelino recalled the strange letters that arrived daily. Some were tragic, claiming a loved one had died while watching the show. Others were blunt requests for money or cars, based solely on the assumption that Carson could afford it. Staffer Jane Rothschild remembered even stranger moments. One fan mailed Carson a chest hair toupee, apparently concerned that his was thinning. Jane was also tasked with managing what the staff called the crazy phone. Carson had one strict rule: callers were never to be hung up on and never treated rudely. As a result, staff spent hours listening to people speak about Carson as if he were a close family member. The office was also flooded with homemade gifts: jars of preserves, loaves of bread, and every kind of pie imaginable arrived daily. Yet none of it could be eaten. The fear of poisoning was real enough that every homemade item had to be discarded. Carson ended his historic run on The Tonight Show in 1992, passing the torch to Jay Leno. He died in 2005 at the age of 79 from respiratory failure. Looking back on Carson's impact, Leno later captured what millions of viewers felt. Johnny Carson was trusted to entertain, to make people laugh, and to speak with a voice that felt unmistakably American. For 30 years, he stayed relevant without chasing trends, clever without becoming disposable, and familiar without ever feeling small. Tiny Tim. Born Herbert Buckingham Corey in 1932, Tiny Tim grew up in the middle of New York City, surrounded by noise, motion, and culture from every direction. His home life reflected that mix. His father was a Maronite Christian from Lebanon, his mother was Jewish and originally from Poland, and together they raised a son who became fascinated with a very specific corner of American culture: the music of the late 1800s and early 1900s. While most kids were listening to whatever was current, Tim was digging backward through time. That obsession took over his life. He eventually left school to chase music full-time, teaching himself guitar, and later picking up the instrument that would become inseparable from his image: the ukulele. There was nothing traditional about how he learned. He never had formal training, and even his most famous trait, that high, fragile falsetto voice, was something he discovered by accident. One day he realized he could sing far above a normal range, and instead of hiding it, he leaned into it. To build his repertoire, he spent countless hours inside the New York Public Library, hunting down forgotten sheet music, some of it dating back to the 1830s. It wasn't nostalgia for him. It was a mission. He saw himself as a kind of musical archivist, bringing old songs back into the world through a very unusual voice. He started out performing in small clubs under a rotating list of stage names before finally settling on the one that stuck: Tiny Tim, a name that played directly against his tall frame and dramatic appearance. The look, the voice, the songs. It all felt strange, unexpected, and oddly charming. That's what made television take notice. His big break came when he appeared on Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, where his first walk onto the stage reportedly caught Dan Rowan completely off guard. From there, the momentum picked up fast. He became a recurring guest on Laugh-In, and then a familiar face on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. By the end of the 1960s, Tiny Tim wasn't just a novelty, he was a fixture. In less than 2 years, he had already appeared on Carson's show 13 times. So when he decided to get married, choosing The Tonight Show as the venue didn't feel random. It felt on brand. On December 17, 1969, Herbert Corey, better known as Tiny Tim, married Victoria Budinger live on television. The moment pulled in over 45 million viewers. At the time, the idea of broadcasting a real wedding on a late-night talk show was unheard of. It felt intimate and massive at the same time. Johnny Carson even addressed the disbelief directly in his opening monologue, making it clear this was real, not a sketch. Tim was 37. Victoria, known as Miss Vicky, was 17. The age gap raised eyebrows, but it also added to the curiosity that drove so many people to watch. nearly 1 out of every 4 Americans tuned in. Despite the scale of the audience, the ceremony itself was surprisingly gentle and personal. The set was decorated with thousands of imported Dutch tulips, but the vows only took about 9 minutes. After the ceremony, Carson interviewed the newlyweds. He complimented Miss Vicky and gave her a polite kiss on the cheek, keeping the moment warm but respectful. Then the show shifted back into celebration. Earlier guests returned to the stage for a toast, but Tiny Tim, true to form, avoided champagne. Instead, he poured milk and honey for himself and his bride, explaining that he no longer drank alcohol and that Miss Vicky had helped him leave that behind. Carson raised his glass and offered a simple wish for their health and happiness. Later in the show, Tiny Tim made the moment even more personal. He sat down with an auto harp and performed a short song he had written for his wife, titled The Wedding Song for Miss Vicky. It was soft, odd, and sincere, filled with gentle lines about their spirits intertwining like flowers. That episode became the highest-rated talk show broadcast in history at the time, a record that stood for decades and was only surpassed by Carson's own series finale in 1992. Tiny Tim and Miss Vicky stayed married for nearly 8 years and had 1 child together before eventually separating. He would go on to marry twice more, affectionately referring to his later wives as Miss Jan and Miss Sue. In November 1996, Tiny Tim died of a heart attack, leaving behind a legacy that was as unusual, tender, and unforgettable as the man himself. Andy Kaufman. In 1977, long before Elvis impersonation became a whole industry, Andy Kaufman walked onto the stage of The Tonight Show and quietly set the blueprint for everything that followed. At first, though, it didn't look legendary at all. It looked awkward, uncomfortable, almost wrong. He opened the set as his timid foreign man character, the same persona that would later inspire Latka on Taxi. He shuffled through a stiff, clumsy Archie Bunker impression, then attempted a weak offbeat version of Ed McMahon's famous introduction for Johnny Carson. The timing dragged. The energy felt off. The audience didn't quite know what they were watching, and that was exactly the point. For over a minute, Kaufman let the room sit in that discomfort. Then the switch flipped. The booming theme from 2001, A Space Odyssey, filled the studio, and Kaufman slowly turned his back to the crowd. Without a word, he began dismantling the character in front of everyone. He peeled off his beige jacket. He tore strips of fabric from his pants, revealing silver studs underneath. He slicked grease into his hair. A leather jacket appeared. With every move, the shy foreign man faded away, and something far more confident took his place. The music swelled. The audience leaned forward. And just when it felt like the transformation was complete, the music restarted from the beginning. Kaufman stretched the tension even further, forcing the crowd to wait, to wonder, to sit inside the buildup. Only after nearly 2 full minutes of this slow, deliberate ritual did he finally grab a guitar and turn back around. That's when he became Elvis. From the first note of Love Me, the illusion was shockingly precise. The voice was right. The phrasing was right. Even the tiny vocal hesitations felt intentional. The audience didn't just recognize the impression, they felt it. The room shifted from confusion into delight almost instantly. Then he moved into blue suede shoes, ditching the guitar and leaning fully into Elvis's physicality. The sharp arm movements, the loose shoulders, the famous hip sways. Backed by the Tonight Show band, who played with bright, swinging energy, the whole performance sounded and felt like a real Elvis set. If someone closed their eyes, they might not have known the difference. What made the performance so powerful wasn't just that Kaufman could do Elvis well. It was the journey he forced the audience to take to get there. By opening with something intentionally awkward and then delivering something nearly perfect, he turned the set into a kind of social experiment. He showed how expectations shape experience. He showed how easily discomfort can turn into awe. Kaufman never saw himself as a traditional comedian. He didn't build toward punchlines. He built toward moments. He used characters, timing, and emotional shifts instead of jokes. And that night on The Tonight Show became one of the clearest examples of that approach. There's also a deeper layer to it. Kaufman had been working on that Elvis impression for years. According to legend, he even hitchhiked to Las Vegas in 1969, hoping to meet Elvis at the International Hotel. He studied him. He practiced him. He didn't parody Elvis, he honored him. That's what separated Kaufman from the wave that followed. The first true Elvis impersonation is often credited to folk singer Phil Ochs, who performed as a politically charged version of Elvis at Carnegie Hall in 1970. But Kaufman's version wasn't satire. It wasn't commentary. It was devotion. It was careful, detailed, and strangely intimate. The timing makes the moment feel even heavier in hindsight. Elvis died just 12 days after Kaufman performed that impression on national television. Almost immediately after, Elvis impersonation exploded into a cultural phenomenon. Kaufman, in a way, stood right on the edge between the real Elvis and the myth that followed him. Kaufman himself didn't live long after that either. He died in 1984 at just 35 years old. And because he spent so much of his career playing with reality, identity, and deception, many fans refused to believe he was really gone. His long-running joke about faking his own death turned into a real conspiracy after he passed. People claimed they saw his character Tony Clifton performing in clubs years later. Some still insist it was all an act. That lingering uncertainty feels fitting. Andy Kaufman never wanted to be pinned down. He never wanted the audience to be fully comfortable. He wanted them leaning forward, unsure, curious, and emotionally involved. And on that night in 1977, with one awkward character, one dramatic transformation, and one flawless Elvis performance, he didn't just entertain the audience, he changed what performance itself could be. Uri Geller. Long before he became the undisputed king of late-night television, Johnny Carson was known by a very different name, the Great Carsoni. At just 14 years old, he was already working as a magician in Nebraska, performing for small crowds for a few dollars a show. That early love for illusion never left him. Even after trading the magic stage for a talk show desk, Carson remained deeply fascinated by how tricks worked and how easily people could be fooled when presentation was done just right. But, as the 1970s rolled in, Carson grew increasingly irritated by a new wave of performers who weren't calling themselves magicians at all. These were the self-proclaimed psychics, people who claimed genuine supernatural abilities and charged serious money to prove it. To Carson, there was a clear line being crossed. Magic was an art built on illusion and honesty about the trick. These new figures, in his view, were using the same techniques while insisting their powers were real. No one represented that trend more than Uri Geller. An Israeli-British sensation, Geller became a fixture on talk shows throughout the decade, dazzling audiences with demonstrations of telepathy, dowsing, and his most famous feat, bending metal spoons using only his mind. He called it the Geller effect, and millions of viewers believed they were witnessing something truly paranormal. Carson was willing to give Geller a platform, but only on one condition. If Geller claimed his abilities were real, Then he would have to demonstrate them under controlled, testable conditions. To make sure everything was fair, Carson brought in the amazing Randy, a master illusionist who had devoted much of his life to exposing people who claimed supernatural powers. Randy had already studied Geller closely and suspected that his performances relied on clever but conventional tricks. Geller's team sent over the props he normally used for his demonstrations. Carson and Randy immediately set them aside. They suspected the secret wasn't in Geller's mind, but in the objects themselves. Instead, Randy prepared a brand new set of materials. Geller would not be allowed to inspect them, touch them, or even see them until the show was live, and he was seated beside Carson. What followed became one of the most uncomfortable moments in late-night television history. The instant Geller saw the unfamiliar spoons and objects, his confidence visibly drained away. He openly admitted that the situation frightened him. For the next 20 minutes, nothing worked. He hesitated, stalled, and searched for explanations. He said the atmosphere wasn't right. He claimed he didn't feel strong enough. He suggested the pressure of the moment was interfering with his abilities. But no matter the excuse, the spoons stayed perfectly still. The New York Times Magazine later described the appearance as a legendary immolation, a slow, public collapse, where Geller sat under the studio lights, unable to perform, while his supposed powers failed again and again. Geller himself knew how bad it looked. He later admitted that he felt humiliated, that he returned to his hotel room devastated and convinced his career was over. He even planned to leave the country the next day, believing he had just been exposed in front of millions. Then, something unexpected happened. Instead of destroying him, the appearance turned Uri Geller into an even bigger star. The spectacle was so dramatic that talk shows rushed to book him. The Merv Griffin Show and others quickly followed. For believers in the paranormal, the failure didn't disprove his powers, it confirmed them. In their eyes, if he had been using simple magic tricks, he would have succeeded anyway. The fact that he didn't only made him seem more authentic. In a strange twist of television history, being dismantled by Johnny Carson ended up doing the opposite of what anyone expected. As Geller later acknowledged, it was that very appearance that truly made Uri Geller. Charles Grodin. Picture Roman Polanski in 1968, deep into the making of Rosemary's Baby. The film is running smoothly, the cast is locked in, and the project is already on its way to becoming a classic, eventually earning multiple Golden Globe and Academy Award nominations. Then, suddenly, everything stops. A minor actor has halted production, not over a major creative choice, but to argue about a single line of dialogue. Years later, that actor, Charles Grodin, would calmly revisit the moment in a 1997 interview with Charlie Rose. He showed no regret and no embarrassment. To him, it wasn't disruption for its own sake. It was simply engagement, being present, being alive. That small story neatly sums up the quality that followed Grodin throughout his career, what critics often described as his infamous churlishness. It became his calling card, especially during his many late-night television appearances where discomfort wasn't a side effect, it was the point. For nearly 5 decades, Grodin carved out a reputation as the most reliably difficult guest on television. Early on, audiences and hosts assumed it was all an act, a deliberately abrasive persona designed to puncture the artificial cheerfulness of celebrity culture. Grodin believed viewers secretly enjoyed seeing politeness challenged, even dismantled. The tension, he felt, was more honest than forced charm. As his career gradually shifted away from acting and toward commentary and punditry, the edge never softened. If anything, it sharpened. Grodin doubled down, daring hosts and audiences to recognize the joke and lean into it, or risk being skewered by it. By the time he made his darker, more unsettling turn on Saturday Night Live, longtime Tonight Show viewers weren't surprised. They had already watched him clash with Johnny Carson on multiple occasions. Carson, in many ways, was the perfect counterpart. He was warm, adaptable, and had a deep appreciation for absurdity. On one famously rough night, when his monologue landed with complete silence, Carson didn't panic. Instead, he staged a mock cleansing ritual, burning his script on stage while the band played taps. He understood that failure, when handled right, could become comedy itself. It's no surprise, then, that after just 2 appearances, Grodin was offered an exclusive guest contract, an almost unheard-of honor at the time. Grodin later noted this achievement right at the beginning of his memoir, fully aware of how rare and significant it was. The dynamic between Grodin and Carson was tense but playful, like a family dinner where everyone knows exactly how far they can push before things fall apart. Grodin fired off sharp critiques, not just at Carson, but at the entertainment industry as a whole. Carson responded with gentle deflection and well-timed humor. In many of those moments, both men seemed to be barely holding back laughter, riding the thin line between confrontation and comedy. During a 1990 appearance, Carson asked Grodin about his famously acerbic demeanor. Grodin responded by implying that Carson wasn't truly interested in the question itself. That exchange followed a familiar pattern. Grodin accused the seasoned host of not genuinely caring about his guests or of focusing too heavily on shallow topics, while Carson played along just enough to keep the tension alive. What stands out in hindsight is how closely Grodin's exaggerated crankiness aligns with the thoughtful social critique he's remembered for today. Beneath the irritation and provocation was a consistent message about authenticity, attention, and the discomfort that comes with actually listening. Albert Brooks. Albert Brooks finally agreed to let his longtime friend Rob Reiner make a documentary about his life for a surprisingly simple reason. He realized that, to many younger viewers, he wasn't the trailblazing comedian or filmmaker at all. He was just the voice of a fish. It was a joke, but it carried a real concern beneath it. That idea sits at the heart of Albert Brooks. Defending my life. The film gently suggests that decades of boundary-pushing work have been quietly eclipsed by Finding Nemo. And it's hard to fault a new generation for the confusion. When a career stretches across stand-up, television, acting, and directing, and reshapes all of them along the way, it can be difficult to know where to begin. Long before he became a scene-stealing presence in films like Taxi Driver and Broadcast News, and well before he directed comedies such as Real Life, Modern Romance, and Lost in America, Brooks was a dominant force on variety television. He wasn't just another stand-up chasing laughs. He was doing something stranger and smarter. His creative process alone set him apart. Most comedians spent months testing material in small clubs, adjusting jokes line by line. Brooks skipped all of that. He would come up with an idea, rehearse it by himself, sometimes in something as mundane as his bathroom, and then take it straight to a national television audience. There was no safety net. Comedy legends like Carl Reiner watched him closely and immediately understood what they were seeing. Brooks wasn't just talented, he was a genuine prodigy. What made his work stand out was its conceptual nature. Brooks didn't simply tell jokes. He challenged the audience's expectations of what comedy was supposed to be. He performed routines that felt more like thought experiments. He imagined a mime who couldn't stop talking, or a circus act forced to replace its elephant with a frog because the star performer failed to show up. The humor came from the idea itself, not from punchlines. One of his most famous routines revolved around a ventriloquist named Dave, who was spectacularly bad at his job. Dave constantly moved his own lips while his puppet, Danny, spoke. Brooks pushed the joke further by pouring water down the puppet's throat as it attempted to sing "I Love Paris." When he performed the bit on The Ed Sullivan Show in January 1971, it wasn't just funny. It was a sharp dismantling of an entire comedy tradition. More than a decade later, on May 17, 1983, Brooks returned to The Tonight Show and expanded that idea even further. This time, he introduced Johnny Carson to Buddy, a ventriloquist partner who wasn't a puppet at all. It was a speak and spell toy dressed up with glasses, a nose, and plastic arms. With Brooks guiding the routine, Buddy communicated using only a handful of robotic letter sounds. Somehow, that limitation made it even funnier. The audience erupted, and Carson leaned fully into the absurdity. Moments like that explain Brooks's lasting influence. He could take the simplest object, strip comedy down to its bare parts, and still find a way to reinvent it. Long before audiences knew him as a fish, Albert Brooks had already changed the language of comedy. Audrey Hepburn. For 30 years, Johnny Carson ruled late-night television without question. During his legendary run on The Tonight Show, he interviewed so many guests that keeping track became impossible. Some, like Don Rickles and Burt Reynolds, appeared more than 100 times. Carson handled them all with the same calm authority, delivering jokes with effortless timing and an unshakable cool that made him seem untouchable. Even today, he's widely regarded as the greatest host the show ever had. But beneath that smooth exterior, Johnny Carson had a weak spot. It surfaced during a memorable conversation with Betty White, when she asked him a deceptively simple question. Was there anyone at all, who could rattle him? Someone who made him genuinely nervous just to speak with? Carson didn't pause. He admitted there was, and he named Audrey Hepburn. The moment surprised even Betty White. By that point, Carson had faced presidents, movie stars, and unpredictable comedians without breaking a sweat. Yet more than a decade after interviewing Hepburn, he confessed that she still lingered in his mind. Even 11 years later, the memory unsettled him. Hepburn had appeared on The Tonight Show in 1976. Carson, usually unflappable, later tried to explain what threw him off. She wasn't cold exactly, just extremely proper, polite, reserved, and somehow that quiet composure completely disarmed him. He recalled feeling unsure of how to approach her, even reenacting for Betty White how he began rambling during the interview before joking that he completely fell apart. By that time, Audrey Hepburn was already a global icon. She had been in the public eye for roughly 25 years, with a career that spanned modeling, Broadway, and some of the most beloved films in Hollywood history. Beyond that, she was also a committed humanitarian and a UNICEF ambassador, respected far beyond the film industry. Seen through that lens, it's easier to understand Carson's reaction. Hepburn carried herself with a grace and gravity that demanded attention without ever asking for it. Her presence alone could fill a room. Yet the image the public knew wasn't the whole story. Hepburn's squeaky clean reputation was, in part, the result of careful studio management. According to later accounts, she once carried on a secret affair with a married co-star and even hoped he would leave his wife. The relationship eventually ended for deeply personal reasons, but the potential scandal posed a serious threat to her career. To keep the story out of the press, Paramount Studios reportedly staged an elaborate distraction. Hepburn was suddenly engaged to a new partner, announced dramatically in front of her former lover and his wife, inside their own home. It was a bold move, designed to shift attention fast and completely. Other aspects of her past stayed hidden for decades. It later emerged that her parents had been enthusiastic Nazi sympathizers, a revelation that would have devastated her career in the 1950s. At the same time, the irony was striking. Hepburn herself had reportedly been active in the Dutch resistance as a young woman, risking her safety during the war. Johnny Carson, meanwhile, had his own connection to that era. He enlisted in the U.S. Navy during World War II, though the conflict ended before he ever saw combat. There's no clear record of how much Carson knew about Hepburn's complicated history when they sat across from each other. But what's obvious is that she carried a lifetime of experience, resilience, and quiet authority. She wasn't just a movie star, she was a force. And for perhaps the only time in his career, that force left the king of late-night television momentarily unsure of what to say next.